The National Desk, America's News Now.
Armed and dangerous and on the loose, the manhunt continues for Robert Card, wanted for the killing of 18 people in Maine.
On day 40 of the stand-up strike, we reached a historic agreement.
Thousands of union workers go back to work at one of the big three, where the strike stands for the other two.
This is the kind of thing that is an absolute catastrophe happening. And the world community really needs to pay attention to this. We have got to get in there.
And then why Israel says it won't allow fuel in as defense forces launch raids, laying the groundwork for the next stage of war. This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Amira David. Breaking news as we come on the air right now. Mass shooting suspect Robert Card still on the loose and considered armed and dangerous. Here's what we know right now. Card is suspected of killing at least 18, with 13 more injured, 3 of which of the injured are in critical condition after shootings at 2 separate locations in Lewistown, Maine. This happening late last night. Shelter-in-place orders, they remain in place and in effect, keeping at least 6 communities in Maine on lockdown. Many of the area's schools, from kindergarten through college, were not open today across the state as police and federal agents actively search for the shooter.
Currently, there is an arrest warrant for 8 counts of murder for Mr. Card, and the reason it's 8 counts because 10 people have not yet been identified. As those people are identified, the counts will probably go to the total of 18.
As the manhunt continues, we are getting a better look at who Robert Card is, a man with a military background, Sergeant First Class. He was a reservist with no military deployments. According to the Army, he is the recipient of multiple standard military awards, but he is also a man with a mental health history. Police said today Card spent at least 2 weeks at a mental health facility this summer before being released. CBS reports Card allegedly threatened to shoot up the base he was previously stationed at after claiming he heard voices. This all began at just before 7 p.m. last night. State police receiving a call of a shooting at a bowling alley in Lewistown. About 10 minutes later, 911 received calls of an active shooting inside a bar nearby. It was at this time that the shelter-in-place warning and order went into effect as that manhunt then began. At around 11:30 p.m. last night, an SUV believed to belong to Card was found in Lisbon, just about 8 miles away, as law enforcement began combing through the area. The National Desk's Brad Rogers gives us a closer look at a community now in mourning.
A surveillance camera at Just-in-Time Recreation captured the gunman, who police identify as 40-year-old Robert Card, as he opened fire on people at the bowling alley. Justin and Samantha Giray bought the bowling alley 2 years ago. We spoke to Justin this morning. He was bowling last night when the gunman opened fire on his staff and customers, and he helped get people out of harm's way through an emergency exit.
I didn't see much. I was bowling, and I turned around. I heard a loud pop. I turned around and saw just an assault rifle, and it was aimed at our counter. Found some emergency exits. The place was busy. I helped get people out of the building.
6 people were shot and killed at the bowling alley, 7 at the bar across town, and 3 more victims died at the hospital.
It's devastating. Because I even said there's a lot of kids that hang out there. Why would somebody do that where kids are? This doesn't happen here.
Justin Giray told us he still doesn't know who was shot and killed and who was wounded at his bowling alley. What he did tell us is the bowling alley was filled with children last night.
We lost some really, really beautiful people. Completely unnecessary, completely uncalled for. Children, place was filled with children. It's not fair. It's not right. And this whole community is affected by it. There were some really great people that were taken from us unjustly.
And just hours later, another mass shooting in North Carolina. 5 people fatally shot near the city of Clinton early this morning. The victims ranging in age from 30 to 80. Investigators at this point unsure how the group is connected or what may have led up to that shooting. A suspect, meantime, still unnamed, not in custody tonight. And in the last 24 hours, there have been 566 mass shootings so far this year. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. That's nearly 2 a day. They define a mass shooting as 4 or more people shot at a time. Since January 1st, there have been 36 mass killings, 4 or more people killed in one incident, leaving at least 190 people dead this year across the country. And all striking UAW workers at Ford plants have been called back to work after the UAW and Ford reached a tentative agreement on a new 4-year contract.
We're going back to work at Ford to keep the pressure on Stellantis and GM. The last thing they want is for Ford to get back to full capacity while they mess around and lag behind.
Now, it could take a few days for the nearly 17,000 striking Ford workers to report, but as they do, the roughly 2,700 laid off non-union workers will be allowed to return to their jobs as well. Right now, Ford leadership working to ratify their offer and then officially pass it on to the union. If they agree on a deal, they'll get a 25% pay raise over 4 years, plus cost of living raises that will push their pay up by about 30%. Workers will see their pensions increase when they retire, and for the first time, the union will have the right to strike if Ford tries to close factories. In response to the Ford strike ending, General Motors said, quote, "We are working constructively with the UAW to reach a tentative agreement as soon as possible." And right now, in the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, the fight for fuel causing hospitals in Gaza to collapse. The World Health Organization says 6 hospitals have shut down because they lack fuel, in addition to those that have been forced to close because of infrastructural damage, spelling huge implications for the newly injured and babies who rely on oxygen supplies. This, as the UN says, the lack of fuel has forced them to scale back in their humanitarian operations. Here's what one Gazan doctor had to say.
The health service in Gaza is on the edge of the abyss, or rather, it has collapsed. We have to exclude medical staff, hospitals, first aid centres from the core of the conflict by making available the necessary fuel, medical supplies and medicines.
Israeli forces have countered those humanitarian calls, saying they believe there's somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million liters of fuel stored inside the Palestinian territory under Hamas control. They continue to argue Hamas leadership could share it with Gazans, but choose not to. Reporters unable to verify that claim. Israel alleging Hamas will confiscate any newly delivered fuel to further its military agenda as the country now prepares for a ground incursion. Overnight, Israel upping ground raids in the territory, as shown by these satellite images that the Gazan Health Ministry, run by Hamas, says has pushed the death toll to over 7,000. Israel says Hamas killed more than 1,400 on October 7th and said today that it now believes 224 people are being held captive in Gaza. Some of those hostages are American. Just today, Senator Chuck Schumer met with the families of those American hostages held by Hamas. 2 Americans, Judith and Natalie Renan, were freed just a week ago, but it's unclear how many more Americans remain. And tonight, a top Iranian official warning the United Nations that the U.S. would see retaliation if Israel continues to expand its military bombardment of Gaza. Speaking in New York, Iran's foreign minister had these words to say, quote, "I say frankly to the American statesmen who are now managing the genocide in Palestine that we do not welcome expansion of the war in the region, but if the genocide in Gaza continues, they will not be spared from this fire." This as Iranian-backed militias continue targeting U.S. forces in the region and fears of a wider war in the Mideast intensify. Our Achal Nashar takes a closer look at Iran's involvement.
On October 7th, when the world learned of the terrorist attacks in Israel, shock and horror set in. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers immediately had questions. How did Hamas manage to execute these attacks, and how were they funded?
We must use every tool at our disposal to ensure that those who carried out these attacks and those who financially supported them will never be able to do that again.
On Thursday, a group of senators turned to experts for answers.
I think we need to take a step back. This attack was financed over decades.
Iran has been a constant source of funding for Hamas since 1987. A more recent source of funding for the group has been through its ability to tax, extort, and racketeer by controlling the Gaza Strip.
Probably at least 2 or 3 times as much money as they get from Iran.
Since Hamas is designated as a foreign terrorist group by the U.S. government, it's subject to sanctions and has limited access to the international banking system. Because of its anonymity, cryptocurrency can provide cover for Hamas. Experts say it uses crypto to fundraise and transfer money within the organization.
Our current laws are inadequate. We have the power to choke off that lifeline.
Bipartisan momentum is building behind legislation that would put more responsibility on crypto platforms like Binance and Tether to know who is using their service and then impose sanctions on those platforms if they're being used to finance terrorist groups. It's something the Department of Justice is already investigating. Meanwhile, some Republicans say they don't support the president's request for humanitarian aid to Gaza because they fear Hamas will intercept it.
What we hear from U.S. taxpayers, they do not want 1 penny of their money going into funding terrorist activity.
The White House says civilian lives depend on the aid, and it will be managed by the State Department and USAID. On Capitol Hill, I'm Atrell Nashar for the National Desk, America's News Now.
And this just in, Pedro Argate, the suspect in the killing of a Maryland judge, has been found dead. Argate found this morning in a heavily wooded area in Williamsport, Maryland, about a mile northwest of where his car was discovered over the weekend. It ends a week-long manhunt. Officials believe Argate shot and killed Judge Andrew Wilkinson on October 19th after Wilkinson had presided over a divorce hearing for Argate where he lost custody of his children.
It's relief, but it's still a tragedy that we're dealing with. Most of us up here, we just came from Judge Wilkinson's viewing, met with the family. They were very appreciative. You know, it brings a little bit of closure to them, but it's still a tragedy.
In Georgia, Republicans had a big setback as a federal judge ruled the state congressional map was drawn in a racially discriminatory manner. The judge has ordered a new map to be reworked to add, quote, a majority black district, and it must be completed by December 8th, or he will not allow 2024 elections to move forward. A new map could flip a seat towards Democrats next year. Similar legal challenges are still in the courts in Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, New Mexico, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Utah. An Ohio woman is being indicted on murder charges in the deaths of at least 4 men in Columbus. The state attorney general accuses Rebecca Auburn of meeting men for sex, then fatally drugging and robbing them. 4 out of 5 of her alleged victims died of overdoses in 2022 and 2023. State officials believe there are more victims. Auburn is being held in jail and is due in court tomorrow. Coming up, a big winter storm is already hitting several states. How this same system is going to impact most of the country by mid next week. Then some places are seeing an uptick in sick raccoon sightings. Why it's causing concern among pet owners. Plus, National Stroke Awareness Day is coming up. What 2 stroke caregivers want you to know. We're back in just 90 seconds. Nothing like October snow. Right now, the season's first major snowstorm is blanketing some northern states. Helena, Montana had more than 13 inches of snow on the ground this morning, and Stanley, North Dakota had 11 inches. And it's not over. More snow is forecast for North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Minnesota tonight. The system will also send a cold front to the rest of the country, impacting almost the entire United States by mid next week. Meanwhile, a tornado touched down in San Antonio this morning. It was considered to be a relatively weak funnel cloud, but it did do minor damage to the area. There were no reports of injuries, which is very good. Mexican authorities say at least 27 people are dead and 3 missing after Hurricane Otis roared along the country's Pacific coast. Tens of thousands of Acapulco residents are without power in homes damaged from the Category 5 hurricane. Mexico's president said not a single power line pole remains standing in the impact zone. Restoring power is now a top priority. And now that the House is back in session, they can now move on a legislation like a resolution to expel Congressman George Santos from Congress. New York Republican Anthony D'Esposito told Politico today that he will introduce that measure by next Wednesday. That means the full House will have to vote on it within the next 48 hours. It would take 2/3 majority to kick Santos out. Santos faces multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He has pleaded not guilty. Congressman Jamal Bowman has to pay a $1,000 fine and write an apology letter to the U.S. Capitol Police Chief for pulling a fire alarm in a House office building last month. A New York Democrat pleaded guilty today as part of a deal with prosecutors. Republicans had accused Bowman of trying to delay a vote, but he says it was just a mistake. And the economy saw strong economic growth in the third quarter. The Commerce Department reported today that the U.S. saw 4.9% annual GDP growth, more than twice the increase seen in the second quarter. GDP, or gross domestic product, is the nation's total economic output of all goods and services. Consumer spending drove that acceleration. Weekly applications for unemployment benefits, those rose slightly last week to 210,000. That was up 10,000 from the week before, which was the lowest amount seen in 8 months. Last week's jobless claims number is still relatively low as the labor market stays resilient in the face of high interest rates and inflation. We have reporters all across the country in your neighborhoods covering the issues that matter most to you. We are taking the pulse of America.
You may see this crisis response car pulling up to emergencies in Seattle. The new CARE team is now the third branch of public safety, along with police and fire.
Every one of those systems you mentioned is absolutely overburdened and buckling under the pressure.
Chief Amy Smith leads the CARE team, which is starting with 6 trained mental health professionals who will respond in real time to 911 calls involving people in crisis.
This is the work of triage. It's not the same thing as, clinical therapy or social work.
The CARE team won't replace police, but they can stay and help someone who's in crisis once police have determined the scene is safe and law enforcement isn't needed.
Hey, baby girl.
2 weeks ago in Cheviot, Jenny Williams' dog sounds the alarm.
She saw a raccoon coming out of the bushes.
But this one,
it was acting kind of strange and wandering around.
Wasn't like any she'd seen before.
Then later that day, it was still out and about and wandering and rubbing its eyes with its paws and going in circles.
All signs that could point to distemper, a highly contagious virus that could potentially cause neurological damage. While humans are immune to it, earlier this year, distemper killed more than 24 dogs at Cincinnati Animal Care.
We hadn't seen distemper here in Hamilton County in years.
The Texas House of Representatives has passed 3 bills that would greatly expand the state's authority over the southern border. One would create a state-level law criminalizing illegal crossings. The measures could pose a challenge as immigration and border security fall under the federal government's jurisdiction. The measures will now go to the Senate, where they are expected to pass. Coming up, strokes are becoming more common in younger adults. How two-stroke caregivers are encouraging others to follow in their footsteps. We'll be right back. This Sunday is National Stroke Awareness Day, and while the prevalence of strokes of U.S. adults 75 or older is declining, it's becoming more common in adults 49 and younger, with more people in need. Two stroke caregivers in Florida have written books to encourage others to follow in their footsteps. The National Desk's Danny Travis has the story.
For Nikki Ganstall, her life was forever changed when her father had a hemorrhagic stroke in 2016, leaving him in a wheelchair for the next 5 years of his life.
Our process was really, we participated in every single therapy and learned how to do his transfers, how to do all of his care at home.
Jerry Goldstein's father had an ischemic stroke 4 years earlier that caused him to become paralyzed in his right arm and acquired aphasia for the next 3 years of his life.
Was helping him every day to practice, to learn everything. What is this thing on the front of your face? It's called a nose.
The changes in mobility for both fathers meant Ganstall and Goldstein became their permanent caregivers.
I would say that day one is the scariest day of your life. You feel like you're looking into a black hole, and there's really no roadmap of what is ahead.
With no roadmap, these women wrote their own. Part of the new day-to-day life became documenting every conversation, every appointment, and every effort to move forward during the rehabilitation process. After the deaths of both fathers, Ganstall and Goldstein used those notes to then write books on the journey.
It really gave me such joy to think back on the memories and to know that not only am I remembering this for me, for my family, but that others might have some use for this insight as well.
Goldstein's book, called Conversations with My Father, focuses on real conversations with her father and the sense of humor that helped them get through those speech barriers. Ganstall's children's book, called Pops on Wheels, was written and illustrated in a way to communicate that change in mobility to young kids.
Help people who are at day one understand that there's life ahead, that you can get back to living when you feel like everything is lost.
Helping people understand there is light at the end of the tunnel, one new chapter at a time.
It's been very heartwarming to know that the efforts and our time that we spent together are actually making a difference in other people's lives.
Coming up, the major event in outer space that was recently picked up by the James Webb Telescope, a billion light years away. We'll be right back. There was a massive explosion in space, more than 1 million times brighter than the entire Milky Way. The James Webb Telescope and other observatories detected the gamma ray burst. It's the second brightest witnessed in more than 50 years. A study in the journal Nature says it made a kilonova, or two neutron stars, merging in a galaxy about 1 billion light years away. Pretty cool. And it's not the Olympics, but a group of Floridians are starting their own competition, poking fun of themselves in the process. The inaugural series of contests set to be called the Florida Man Games, an ode to Florida's reputation for producing some strange news stories. And the contests planned for next year are just as strange and comical. They're going to feature an evading arrest obstacle course in which participants will be trying to escape real police officers chasing after them, and beer belly wrestling. That one, of course, self-explanatory. Sounds like quite the spectacle. That does it for this edition of the National Desk. We do invite you to join us again this evening for more coverage of America's top stories. Just check your local listings. Have a great night.